robust Scrum product owners. This module we're going to be talking about value. How do you understand what value the work that you are doing is bringing? How do you order the items in the backlog? And I'm going to tell you, this is a very important topic, and it's a topic that has just gone through a massive change in the Agile community. What we used to do is old school financial valuation. We used to build financial models using terms like ROI and NPV. We used to do marketing surveys, and then we used to build out financial metrics and then execute against those financial metrics. Typically that involved several months of time up front doing marketing surveys and other activities like that, and then developing a multi-month roadmap that we would then execute against. People in the Agile community who are on the cutting edge no longer do that. In the new school world, we believe that we're in a world of extremely high uncertainty. We don't know anything. There's no information inside of the company that actually matters. Everything is just a hypothesis. Everything is an assumption. So what we can do then in the new school world is to take those assumptions and then go out into the market as quickly as possible and validate those assumptions. The market has the truth. The truth is not inside of the building. The truth is outside in the real world. And that's really what I want to talk about and focus on. It's super interesting, super helpful, but it's super hard. However, I recognize that many of you are still in the old school world, where you need to build a spreadsheet model of the value of what you're creating. And you need to go and talk to the CFO or a senior manager to justify the value of the work that you're doing. So what we're going to do is spend about 5 minutes here talking about the old school way to do value. I know that many of you are still in that old school world. So I invite you to use the 30-minute one-on-one consultation you have with me to dive into that material if that's what you have to do on a daily basis. As soon as we spend 5 minutes on that old school stuff, the rest of the module is going to be about the new school world where we're using hypothesis-driven development to extract information about value from the market as quickly as possible. Now, I've emphasized throughout this course the incredible importance of doing the homework. The homework in this section is incredibly important. You've got to do it. It's extremely difficult. It's extremely time consuming. I want you to see how hard it is to shift to this new model. The old model is a lot easier. You sit at your desk, you do a market survey, you build an Excel spreadsheet model. The new world means going out and talking to customers, going through ideation, prototyping, testing, in a loop as quickly as possible. It requires you to be externally focused and have an intimate connection with the customer. Let's get started with a brief overview of the old school world, and then we'll shift to the new school world. Let's get right into it. This is old school versus new school ways of determining value and ordering your product backlog. Let's start off with old school. Pragmatic Marketing has a great screenshot on their website that describes the steps that a product owner would go through in the old world. It starts here way on the left side with understanding the market, and then goes all the way to the right side where you're supporting sales and the product. So incredibly, you see that nowhere on here is there a close interaction between the development team and the product owner on actually developing the product. All of this is thinking in a room, planning, doing marketing surveys, looking at research. There isn't a close, intimate relationship among the product owner, the customer, and the development team. Now, this might be what your product development process looks like at your work.
in which case I encourage you to take a look at this model because it does a great job of describing the old school world. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take the first few segments here, market, focus, business, planning, and just pick out a few things and share with you what they mean. So let's start off with market. Market problems. Interviewing customers often through surveys. One of the characteristics of old school is that we do a lot of talking and not a lot of prototyping or testing. In the new school world, we don't do surveys by and large, whereas in the old school world, we do lots of surveys. A second box here in market is to identify the strengths and weaknesses of competitors and alternatives and position your product so that it does something that's better or different. A third component is to assess your strengths. What is your company good at? What is your company bad at? You can recognize all of this as MBA type of thinking. How about focus? Distribution strategy. Once you have a product, how are you going to sell it? How are you going to get it to the customer? Determine the channels. The product portfolio. You might already have products in this space. How do they all work together? And how do you manage products so that they're simple and easy to understand from the customer's perspective? And then the product roadmap. You're going to develop the product. There are going to be various phases. Different features will be released at the end of every phase. That's the product roadmap. The business itself, the business model, pricing. Decide how you price the product by doing an analysis of the market. Is the market elastic or inelastic? Buy, build, or partner. Decide on whether you want to buy components of the strategy or build it yourself or do something in between by partnering with someone who has part of the solution. How about planning? So this is an exact quote from the Pragmatic Marketing website where it talks about position. It says, create internal positioning documents. And this really captures the philosophy and the approach of the old school method. It's all about doing internal work inside of the building, not a lot of contact with the customer. And it's also a lot about documents. Let's go through this process, this methodology. Let's check off these boxes and make sure that internal stakeholders have what they need to write the $10 million check to develop the product. User personas. That's something that we use in the new school world, but this is done in a very heavy-handed way without having a feedback loop. Thirdly, stakeholder communication. We've convinced all of these stakeholders to write us a $10 million check. How are we going to tell them the progress of the product? So that's the old school approach. Here are some of the differences between the new school and the old school. David Anderson says, forget this idea of calculating business value. Those are just made up numbers. And that's the core philosophy of the new school world. It doesn't matter how many documents you write. It doesn't matter how many stakeholders give you the thumbs up. It doesn't matter how many Excel spreadsheets you have with financial models. The answers are not in your head. They're not in your stakeholders' heads. They're not anywhere inside of your company. You discover the truth of value by producing things and going out into the real world and evaluating them. So the second point is that everything is a hypothesis. Everything is an assumption. Everything is a guess. And so everything needs to be rigorously and scientifically tested. Opinions do not count, even if they come from a senior vice president. The market decides what's right and what's not right. So the key question that you ask yourself in the new school market is, how quickly can you get to the customer? Does it take you 3 months, 3 weeks, or 3 hours? The person who can do this as quickly as possible will learn the most. He who learns fastest wins. So the model here is called lean startup and here's the top level view of it. You build something, you measure, and then you learn. And build does not mean build a product. Build means create the minimal prototype, object, test, question necessary to learn something. It could be a conversation. It could be a landing page. It could be a Google ad. It could be a prototype. It could be a clickable PowerPoint. What's most important is the speed with which you go through this loop. Top companies can go through this loop for many, many features in less than a week. Let's look at that in a little bit more detail. This is a validation board produced by Lean Startup Machine. So the way that you read this board is that you start on the upper left-hand corner. There are 3 hypotheses: customer, problem, and solution. You start by evaluating and determining who your customer and who your problem is. And these things go in a pair. Different customers will have different problems. And so you iterate, you pivot back and forth between customer and problem, until you've nailed it down. You have a customer set and a problem that they have. And then you'd figure out what solves that problem for that particular customer. How do you do that? For every customer and problem, you figure out on the lower left-hand corner what experiment you're going to run. You list all of your assumptions. You list all of your guesses. You list all of the things that you believe are true but don't have data. Then in the yellow box, you select your riskiest assumption. And then you devise a method and a minimum success criteria to test that. So an example of a method is that you explore the concept with 10 customers and 5 of them tell you that they actually have the problem. And then you get out of the building, you don't do this inside of your company, and you either invalidate or validate. If you validate, then you go ahead and extend it from customer and problem to solution. If you invalidate, then you need to pivot on customer and problem and keep trying again and again until you get something that's validated. Let's do an example here by describing first what an experiment is. So first, you have to have a hypothesis which can be validated or invalidated. Very often I see people say, we're going to try something and see what happens. That's not a hypothesis. It's not an experiment. If you try something and see what happens, something will always happen. So you'll always be validating and you'll never be able to invalidate. Another example is something that's wishy-washy. Women think that their clothes don't fit. That's really subject to interpretation. Try to make the hypothesis as objective and quantitative as possible. Here's an example of a good hypothesis. 8 out of 10 women who shopped online in the past month bought at least one item that did not fit. Now that's something that's testable. Second key component of an experiment is that it has an experimental method which can be replicated. A bad example here is we're going to go to the mall and talk to a few women. Exactly what kind of mall is it? Are you allowed to skip over women who don't seem like a good fit? And what does a few women mean? What you're trying to do here is to be as clear and specific as possible so that you don't trick yourself. That's what you have to avoid here. Everyone is always very enthusiastic about their customer, their problem, and their solution. And you have to protect against that enthusiasm and not fool yourself. Self-deception is one of the greatest sins of being a product owner. And thirdly, an experiment is reversible. It's not damaging if it doesn't work out. The idea is you're going to be invalidating a whole bunch of things before you find something that actually works. In fact, if you're validating over 50% of your hypotheses, it's an indication that you're being too soft. You're being too nice to yourself. So here's an example of something that's not reversible. We'll spend 18 months and $3 million building a solution and see what happens. That's just terrible. If at the end of those 18 months, you decide that the experiment has failed, wow, that's going to cost a lot. Here's something that is reversible. We'll create a lightweight prototype, ideally time boxed to a day or two, and see if anyone clicks on this button. So those are some of the key aspects of an experiment. Remember to be very rigorous and very demanding so that you don't fool yourself. So here's our validation board again. Let's say I'm a product owner and I'm interested in creating games for kids, and in particular, physical games for kids. So I start off with a customer hypothesis. My customer are kids between the ages of 6 and 9, and they're bored because they spend their entire day playing with their iPads, and they're not engaging in any physical movement. On the lower left, you see what I believe are my two biggest assumptions. The first one is that I can reach kids between the ages of 6 and 9, and the second is whether or not I can assess that this is the problem that they have. So I believe that the riskiest assumption is that they can assess whether or not they're bored or not, and that I can assess whether or not they are actually bored. So that's my riskiest assumption in the yellow box. And I'm going to have a playground conversation with these kids, and if 5 out of 10 of them say that they're bored, then I'm going to validate. So I go ahead and I run that experiment, and I invalidated it. I discovered that I cannot assess whether or not kids are bored. But here's what I learned. When I was on the playground, I spoke to a lot of parents of kids that are between the ages of 6 and 9. And I discovered that they're scared that their kids are going to spend too much time playing with their iPad. So I'm going to pivot. And I'm going to pivot the customer hypothesis and the problem hypothesis in this case. So my customer now are parents of kids between the age of 6 and 9. And the problem hypothesis is that they're scared that their kids are just going to wind up playing on their iPads and are not going to learn any physical play. So what I do now is I erase everything in the lower left-hand corner, design experiment, and the riskiest assumption. I keep invalidated here because that's a history of the experiments I've run. So now the new cards here in design experiment are assumptions about the first pivot. So my first assumption is that parents care about physical play at all. Maybe they're perfectly fine with having their kids play on their iPads the entire day. The second big assumption is that they think of this as a critical issue. And so I'm going to design a conversation that I have with them to determine if they believe this is a critical issue. I'll once again go to a playground and talk to parents of kids that are between the age of 6 and 9. And this time, since I have a little bit of evidence already that this is okay, I'm going to be comfortable with 4 out of 9. If 4 out of 9 parents think that this is a critical issue, I'm going to proceed. And this time, it is validated. It is a critical issue for kids. So now I'm going to copy over parents and scared as my customer hypothesis and my problem hypothesis, and I'm now going to go to solution. And what I'll do now is I'll continue pivoting on the solution until I find one, using the same procedure. So again, I leave invalidated and validated as my history, and I start off with assumptions about wooden blocks. Are parents okay with wood? And is it the case that I'm not already duplicating something? And I'll continue doing this again and again and again until I find a solution. And then I'll think about productizing this. So this is the way to use build, measure, learn in a very tight feedback loop, constantly getting out of the building and talking to the customer and validating your customer, your problem, and your solution. You'll be doing an extended example of this in the next video. Here's another example. How did I go about developing this course? I didn't talk to people. I didn't look at a market survey. I didn't see who was going to various types of workshops. What I did was I created 6 nearly identical Google ads. They all have the same detailed explanation Here it says detailed step-by-step guidance with videos and checklists. The only difference is the title, how to be a product owner, how to be a Scrum Master, facilitating agile meetings, and so forth. And then I looked at who clicked on what. So if you see here on the right-hand side, 70% of the clicks were for the product owner, and 12% of the clicks were for Scrum Master. So product owner was a huge, huge area of interest. I validated it in another way. I looked at visits to bounce pages. These are landing pages which attempt to sell the course. And once again, you see that how to be a product owner had 121 visitors, and how to be a Scrum Master had 68 visitors. So how to be a product owner was, again, more than twice as much as how to be a Scrum Master, which was number 2. The numbers are slightly different than in the Google AdWords, but they still show how to be a product owner is the number 1 issue that people are facing. And so these 2 pieces of evidence were enough for me to go ahead and start developing this course. And then, of course, I validated all of the individual content by actually communicating and doing experiments with product owners and potential clients of this course. Design thinking is another way of looking at this. You start off with empathizing with the customer in a way that similar to what I've described here. You define the issues, right? Spend a lot of time on empathize and define. In fact, I've heard people say that you should spend over 50% of your time in this area. Then go wide and engage in divergent thinking. Prototype things and then test, okay? So here's a great example of this at Travelocity. Back in the day, Travelocity allowed you to buy a hotel, buy an airplane fare, or rent a car. And they wanted to know if people wanted to buy packages. So they did a 1-week test where they simply added a button that said hotel plus air. That button did absolutely nothing. All it did was lead to an error page. And all they did in this 1-week test was count how many times someone clicked on that button, right? This is an example of going through the entire build, measure, learn loop for an actual problem that this company had. And they discovered that a lot of people clicked on hotel plus air, and therefore they went ahead to the next step. A good question to ask is, if you're in the old school world, how do you shift management? My suggestion is that you start off really, really slowly, because it's going to take time to change the culture, the strategy, and the basic facts of the everyday work that people do. Here's a simple question to start with. How many times did we ship a product that did not deliver value? This has probably happened many, many times in an organization that uses the old school approach. A second thing you can do is, on an individual basis, you can run tiny little experiments against the work that you're doing. So you can still do the old school stuff while incorporating, just at the level of your team, some of the experimental approach that I've described here. And then you can share with management what you've learned, and then you can ask the bigger question: should we take this up to the level of annual planning or portfolio planning? And finally, share case studies. Most of this work of the new school method comes from the Lean Startup, and they've got a great website which shows case studies. So take a look at those case studies. You'll be doing that for the homework, and share one of those examples with management. So that's been an overview of the old school versus the new school approach. And now we'll dive into the new school approach in the next exercise with the next video.